Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this a LinkedIn Live discussion from the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And we're discussing today our upcoming conference, Indigenous Values Are Driving Business Deals. This will be a preview of the conference, which will be taking place on April 24th and 25th of this year in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I'm your co-host and the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Coalition, Mark Podlasly. My ancestral name is Tatsha, and I'm a member of the Intlaka'pim Interior Salish First Nation in British Columbia and Washington State. And I'm very pleased to welcome my friend and co-host today to this event, Mark Trahant. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Thank you. Great to see you, Mark. Mark Trahant, and I am citizen of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes in Idaho and editor-at-large at ICT, once called Indian Country Today.
Well, Mark, thank you for joining us today. And I'd just like to point out that ICT, formerly known as Indian Country Today, is our official media sponsor in the United States, our Indigenous media, for the conference. The conference itself, this will be the 6th year we've run the conference, and the conferences put on by the First Nations Major Projects Coalition are a blend of interests between Indigenous and industry. A lot of the members of the coalition here in Canada, 130, are very interested in participating in economic and environmental decisions in projects that are happening or proposed in their territories. The projects themselves span the gamut from energy to energy transmission to transportation corridors to pipelines and energy export facilities. For those of you who are not familiar with the coalition, we are a skills providing nonprofit Indigenous-led organization that assists nations or tribes here in the United States be ready at the negotiation table for these projects. We support 8 projects valued at a total capital cost of $20 billion right now, and we have demands for more projects coming in all the time. This conference is an opportunity for our members, Indigenous, to meet those industry participants and governments representatives who are interested in participating in growing the Indigenous economy and at the same time helping overall American and Canadian economies and citizens. So the conference itself goes over 2 days. This is an extension, as I mentioned, of a previous set of conferences. Last year, it was Net Zero by 2050. And Mark, that was your first conference that you'd attended with us. Do you want to give us some thoughts about what you found?
Sure. Well, and it's funny because I've been writing about these issues for a while, and especially in the last year, the economic side of it. And I have to tell you that every time I have a conversation about green energy or some of the complexities of the choices ahead, I tell people you need to go to this conference. It's the one thing that can help set the framework. And it's partly because the values are critical, but also having the expertise to be able to argue with industry about why the values matter and how to put them in perspective. And I think what's so important about the First Nations Major Projects Coalition is to be able to do both at the same time. And I think that's a really useful tool for tribes.
Thank you. You came last year. You were one of the, you were a speaker, actually. You were moderating a discussion. You were there. You would have seen 1,300 people came in person to the conference itself to discuss these issues. So this year, we will be extending that. Last year was on net zero. This year, we're talking about Indigenous values. And you had mentioned you write often on these issues in the United States. Did you find that a lot of the topics that we raised in Canada were also relevant to tribes in the States?
Absolutely. In fact, and I know we've had this conversation, but it's really important that at some point there be a similar organization and conference in the States, because as you look out to the green economy and the kinds of things, the decisions we're going to have to make, it's so important to have this broader conversation and to develop the expertise to be able to delve into the issues. And that's sometimes lacking in some of these issues. We mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the latest enterprise to put federal resources into the shift. And it's $750 million. And that's a lot of money. But that money won't be effective unless there's a good thought through plan about how to make it work and how to be effective and to hold companies accountable so that when they say we're a green company, you can say, okay, what does that mean? And how does it fit with Indigenous values? And I think those are really critical conversations. And having a framework about how we have those conversations is what you get out of attending First Nations Major Project Coalition meeting.
You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. In Canada, nations or tribes on this side of the border are very interested in how the machinery of that works, how the investment in Indigenous economies benefits everyone. And we will be having at the conference the Assistant Secretary the Assistant Secretary to the Department of Energy coming to speak and explaining some of how that's come to pass. We will also have a number of tribal representatives from tribal governments in the United States explaining how they intend to apply those funds and ensure that their economies are built to native values, to Indigenous values across the board. So you mentioned as well the tribal aspect of that. We are all one people. I am from a nation on this side. Actually, we're on both sides of the border. You are on the southern side, but we are all one nation on Turtle Island. So this is a learning exercise for both of our respective nations to apply the best thinking possible. I just want to point out in the conference itself, if you're coming this year, the website will be up there on the screen, FNMPCindustryevent.com. You can download a preliminary agenda of the conference. The conference will focus on values, and this came out of the discussion last year at our Net Zero conference of the 1,300 participants, where they agreed that yes, the transition to net zero is important, and yes, it's important to engage in industry and Indigenous people at the same time. What came out though in the feedback was, how do you do it? What are the mechanics that make a successful project, a successful deal, not just for the deal, but also for Indigenous people? That's what we're driving into on this conference. If you download the summary agenda, you'll find 4 topics that we'll be focusing on. The energy transition, and this is again from an industry and Indigenous engagement perspective. So the energy transition, finding capital. One of the things that's come up for us in the coalition is Indigenous people, nations and tribes. It's important, it's essential that we have access to affordably priced capital to make the investments in our economies and improving our environment. We will have a large discussion there on different financial mechanisms, green bonds, sustainability bonds, all from an Indigenous perspective, how those could be applied to Indigenous objectives. We will also have a discussion on the innovative public policy. And that's what you already talked about, Mark, on sort of the IRA as one of them, but there are others. We're also going to be asking a lot of the American participants to come, when they come, is to ask questions. Just so you know, and Mark, maybe we can mention this too, is that when we had our conference last year, we focused very specifically on questions from the audience. The questions that you have particularly, either you're in industry, on something you're grappling with, or if you're from an Indigenous community, a nation, what are the issues you're focused on? The other issues that we will be dealing with in here as well is successful deal making. We will have the CEO of Enbridge Corporation on stage answering, taking questions and responding to issues from an Indigenous concern. They will be talking very much about a recent project that they had initiated and concluded, including 23 Indigenous nations in their pipeline operations around a carbon capture and pipeline transmission facility in Alberta. And for the energy transition, we're very pleased to be able to announce that we have an Indigenous party, or excuse me, Indigenous nation from Australia coming, who will be presenting about their role in a 62 gigawatt green hydrogen production facility that will be exporting ammonia to Asia. So Mark, you came last year and you heard a number of these Indigenous leaders speaking. Is there anything you wanted to share for our audience, for those who have not come before?
Well, I think the takeaway for me is that this provides an alternative to litigation. And so many of the major projects in the United States are stuck in a cycle where one side is litigating the other, and it goes on and on and on, and it doesn't get anywhere towards either climate impact or actually benefiting the community. And this is an avenue that says, here's a different way, here's a way to think about it differently, and here are the tools to make that happen. And I think that's really useful. It's really interesting to me that so many of and particularly that broader discussion about how do you get unstuck from a lot of these really deep controversies. And values are certainly a part of that, because in some cases, tribal enterprises might have a different way of producing it that is better for everybody involved. And from the company side of the equation, it could save them a lot of money by doing this route instead of having this constant. I mean, the thing about litigation is only the lawyers come out ahead. Everything else gets stuck for years and years and years.
So thank you. At the conference you saw, and you would have seen this, we have rooms set up on the side, a deal-making lounge where nations and companies can go off and have open conversations about what they're both hoping to achieve. What we hope at what we do strive for at the coalition is having those open discussions, as you say, to avoid the conflict that comes. Litigation, yes, it serves lawyers. We are a conference of the possible, where we can come together, an Indigenous-led conference where discussions happen exactly as you said, to be able to look through for solutions that help both parties. The conference that you were at last year, can you remind me, you interviewed, you were leading a panel, you interviewed a number of discussions. Could you just share who was on your panel?
It was a panel from De Beers and how they changed some of the framework for how they look at projects. And it was a broad discussion about how the companies changing on mining had really changed over time.
And you were focused very much, that's right, with, it was Mark Podlasly, who was the CEO of Anglo American, the parent company of De Beers. And that conversation is something that you will not generally get in the media, in the mainstream media for sure. I know at ICT you would do that, but in the mainstream media, it's not often that an Indigenous party can have a CEO of a world mining company on stage to answer questions like that, to present not only their case, but to hear from Indigenous people about what's important and where we're going. The conference this year, sorry, go ahead, excuse me.
Oh, I was just going to say, and that's so important because what companies often miss, and I think they get this perspective at this conference and other tribal communities, is seeing the flip side of mining and the long-term implications. They only see the bottom line and not the real impact of the community. And what this allows them to do is to start thinking about mitigation in a whole different light, because it's a long-term one based on what's best for both parties.
And so that's the benefit of this in a conference. You do get that opportunity to go to the other side of the discussion. What are they thinking? Where are they going from an Indigenous perspective? And let's face it, for a lot of industry participants who come to our conferences, this is a place where they can meet the Indigenous leaders from these communities in one place. So we are very proud of the convening function of this conference. I'd just like to remind anyone that's viewing, there is a chat function on the side if you have questions that you'd like to raise, and already there's a few of them coming in here. And I'm very pleased to see that there are some of my, my fellow First Nation members from Manitoba online as well and watching. If you have questions, please present them here. We'll answer them ourselves. If you are just joining us, I'm going to refer you back to the website on the screen there, FNMPCindustryevent.com. And you'll find the conference there, which will be held in Vancouver later this year in April. And you can find information about the agenda online. Just to reiterate, the agenda will cover deal making and how it strengthens Indigenous and general economies. So if you take a look at that, you'll see the agenda can be downloaded right now. You'll take a look there. We are announcing speakers as they come forward, as we confirm them. So we do have a number of speakers, and we're focusing on 4 distinct areas: energy transition, finding affordable capital, innovative public policy, and successful deal making. If you are joining us, the coalition itself is a collection of 130 First Nations across Canada. Mark Trahant is the editor-at-large at Indian Country Today. I'm sorry, ICT. It's always going to be Indian Country Today to me forever, because that's how I've always known it.
Right. Actually, Canadians are the ones that kept pushing us to change the name.
Oh, really? Oh, we're just too politically correct, I suppose, right? So, okay.
Yeah,
well, ICT. Go ahead.
And young people.
Young? We're young. We're not senior elders yet, right? So if you so come to the conference, we will be discussing the topics we were just discussing at the conference last year about how projects will be presented, Indigenous industry, successful engagements, deals. There's a question that just come in about hydrogen. Yes, we are talking about hydrogen. In the section on energy transition, we will be focusing on 3 topics: hydrogen, SMR nuclear, small modular reactors, and LNG as a transition fuel to a greener future. So those three will be up. The question that came in about hydrogen, we are talking and we will be presenting what we found is the biggest Indigenous involvement in a hydrogen project in the world. And it's an Indigenous party in Western Australia. It's the Mirning people. They will be coming to discuss a 62 gigawatt clean hydrogen facility that they are developing in conjunction with partners to export hydrogen to Japan and Asia. They are coming and they will explain how they came about that. It uses wind and solar power. They are located on the ocean, so they'll be able to transport it out. But it is the largest hydrogen project in the world of its kind, and it has an Indigenous partner. So yes, to the person who asked that question, come, ask questions. How that can be replicated in the United States and Canada, that will be up to the nations who host these projects, but it's an excellent learning opportunity to ask those questions. So there is another question that's come in here about the models in terms of how this would affect deals, capital access. What I do want to point out is that we are talking about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which Mark has just pointed out. Maybe you could repeat that, Mark, about just give us a summary of what the IRA means to tribal groups in the United States, tribal nations.
Sure. It's $750 million, so about 720 million. Big bulk of that was for climate resilience, and that includes everything from maintenance programs to fish hatchery reduction and changes, high efficiency electric home rebuilding, energy loan guarantees. I think there's a total of $20 billion available just for that, and emergency drought relief. The electrification is really interesting because it's something you don't think about, but one of the, and I guess put this in real basic terms, one of the things to consider is that the pipes have to get bigger. So if you have a electric line, what worked for coal is not going to work for green, and you've got to actually have more capacity on those lines. And so a lot of the utilities across the world are now figuring out how to transition in just to bigger delivery systems. That and batteries are probably the two biggest issues facing both companies and those of us that consume power for the next decade ahead. I'd say that actually that and water, those three things would be the big ones for us to think about.
So a lot of the issues you mentioned, yes, in the tribal situation in the United States, but they're the same issues that we're facing on this side of the border. For those of you who just joined, I pointed out earlier is that this is Turtle Island. We are one people, Indigenous people across North America. So this conference itself, even though it's being hosted in Vancouver on the Canadian side of the border, is very much a continental approach. We have the same water, we have the same air, we have many of the same cultures. My nation is on both sides of the border. Last year at the conference, we had a large contingent of US tribal representatives who came not only as speakers, but also as attendees. Our speakers last year as well included officials from the United States government. We had the US Secretary of Energy come, and she gave us our keynote on the opening. And again, the question about our united future, we are one people. If you have an opportunity to go to FNMPCindustryevent.com, you will also find at the top a link to last year's conference, and in the agenda on that page, you'll see reference links to all the videos that happened on the conference. So if you're new to us this year and you'd like to see the type of discussions that will be happening on stage, click on those and take a look. We will be having open questions with all our participants. So last year, CEO of major mining companies like Anglo American, they're on stage. We had the North American CEO, of Rio Tinto Aluminum, if you're from North America. Again, questions are open. This is an open dialogue between Indigenous people and industry. And please, the questions that you raise, they will be addressed. So if there's any other questions, please send them in. Mark, you came last year as well, and you met a number of Canadian First Nations for the first time, I suspect. Did you?
Oh, no, I've done a lot of stories over the years, so they weren't.
Well, tell us. Tell us.
Yeah. But one thing I would add to that is one of the rich parts of this conference is not just what happens on stage, but that when people exit the stage, they're still willing to talk. And right after some of the conversations I had last year immediately after a panel were, to me, as rich as some of the ones on stage. So that networking possibility, I think, is really extraordinary. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this was just a huge takeaway for me last time, is you put together a panel on Native women in finance, and you would think you would have to scramble to find enough participants just to put people on stage, but the talent pool was so great that you actually had to have two panels. And even that was limited by 4 hours. I mean, it really was an amazing group of people. And I think the talent that you'll see out across Indian country that is working on deals, working on coming up with new innovative solutions, ranging from Navajo Power to Quebec Hydro, are really fascinating, especially in this era of climate change.
So you mentioned the panel, Indigenous Women in Sustainable Finance, and you're right, that was rated as our best panel last year, and there were Indigenous women from across North America on that panel. If you go to the website again, FNMPCindustryevent.com, go up to the agenda for the 2022 conference and click through to the second day, you will find a recording of that session. And you're right, it was astounding, not only in terms of leadership, but depth of skills, very open about sharing on stage with our participants. We're going to repeat that this year with a panel on Indigenous youth and values going forward, because a lot of these issues that we're talking about now, not just the climate transition, but economic involvement and environmental impact, will be borne by the next generation. So we will have a panel very similar to the one that you just mentioned on Indigenous youth. We are reaching out to Indigenous youth in both sides of the border because, again, we are one people. There is a question on the side about hydrogen as top subject, ammonia as a fuel source. So if you just joined us, one of our key speakers this time will be an Australian Indigenous nation who is the driver behind a 62 gigawatt green hydrogen export facility in Australia. They will be exporting their their hydrogen as ammonia. Hydrogen cannot be transported in its raw form. It has to be transferred into another transportation mechanism, and it's ammonia in most cases. So yes, we're going to have a large discussion around that. And to the individual who asked that question, the Australians and their partners in this 62 gigawatt facility will be answering questions. What we're hoping for, and it has happened in previous conferences, is that Indigenous people who come to these conferences can ask open questions about where did the communities find their capital? Was it a good partner? What worked? What didn't? How do you convince your own community at times who may not be supportive of a project? Also, we will hear from industry presenting their side of negotiations. So, Mark, I want to ask you another question. You're coming to the conference this year. You
Yes.
will be participating. ICT as the media partner. Can you describe to us the role ITC will be playing in the conference this year?
Well, I mean, definitely highlight, and we'll try to make sure to have some of the participants on our broadcast. And this is where it gets into the journalism values. I know there will be news out of it, so I'm not worried about this happening. But we now reach about 70% of the PBS system in the States. And actually, our largest Canadian audience is in Winnipeg. And eventually, I'd like to see our show on in Canada as well.
That would be amazing. And I know we can access it through the internet. I know that because we can subscribe as well and pick it up that way. We did find that last year, you wrote a piece afterwards, and the quote that you used in your piece was the one that we used to reference the post-conference report. The post-conference report was all roads to net zero lead through Indigenous lands, which is true. And in this case of Canada and the United States, in Canada, for sure, any lands that are going to be used towards net zero, and that includes accessing minerals, new power sources, transmission lines, are going to go through Indigenous lands. There's no way to get to a net zero future without us. And I think you made that very clear in the piece that you presented.
And this idea of a shared governance about some of these issues, and to allow tribal communities to reap the plus side, not just the negative side of strategic minerals, I think is really essential, because if we look out in the future 20, 30 years, if it's a fight, we're never going to get to net zero. If it's cooperation and a shared plan that works for everybody, we have a much better shot at it.
And I think that goes forward for not only Indigenous people reaping the benefits. One thing I just want to point out too, at the coalition, no, from an Indigenous perspective, is a totally valid answer towards development. And a lot of the coalition's work that we do is not about supporting individual projects. It's supporting about free, prior informed information, prior informed conversations, because the nations in the end have to make the decision whether this is something they want or not. So no is a very valid answer.
And then when projects break apart, it's because that part of the equation is a failure. And we're seeing that right now in the States with really some important projects that ought to have buy-in early, but they're not going to happen because there's so much competition over really structure of the deal, let alone whether it works for everybody.
And that discussion is something that is very hard to have in the heated moment of the media at times, or where things are happening in sound bites and battles in newspapers and on television, which is why we at the coalition value so much the audience that comes, and we provide the opportunity, as you said, networking off stage, because it gives that opportunity to happen. There is a question here about First Nations groups in Ontario and Quebec. If you go to the main website of the coalition, which is not that one, it's FNMPC.ca, and go under the About Us, you'll see the membership. There's a map in there. It'll show the members. There are a number of new members in Ontario who are joining the coalition. And the interest of them is the same thing we just discussed, this free, prior informed information, free, prior informed conversations, and the skills that we provide to First Nations. I'd just like to point out that the coalition is a nonprofit. We do not take percentages of deals. We do not have finder fees. Our mission is to allow those nations to have the information they need to make informed decisions in technical, legal, environmental sciences. In terms of Quebec, there is a First Nation that is about to join the coalition. And if you're a nation here and you're interested about joining the coalition, it's a free thing. We just require a band council resolution from your nation asking membership, and that's it. You have all access to our information. If you go to our website under the resources tab, you'll see the information that's been produced so far. And they run the gambit from information sessions around capital access, net zero. It's all available for free to First Nations to use as they wish. The topics that are on there, including environmental surveys, environmental information, how to run an Indigenous-led environmental assessment process, all of those were produced by our coalition at the request of our members. So if there is a question that comes up in your nation where you need that information, you can access it there, or as a member, you can request that we produce that information. We will find the speakers. We will find the information that you require to make an informed decision. Mark had pointed out in the United States, a lot of the issues are similar that we come through. Not had an American request yet for direct information, but I'm sure it's coming. And Mark, you pointed out that you were there. You met many of the tribal government officials that came in, and they had often said they needed something like this in the United States.
Right. Well, I mean, you look at the complexities, and there's just so much going on in so many areas, and Rio Tinto would be a great one where it's a very confrontational relationship with the tribe. And if there were a way to reset that kind of relationship, it would be really interesting to see what would happen.
So we will have Rio Tinto at our conference. So we've, as many of the other mining companies as well, and some of the energy companies as well. I am watching the time. We are running out of time, Mark. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. If you're watching, again, this is about the First Nations Major Projects Coalition Industry Event Conference coming up in Vancouver in April. FNMPCindustryevent.com. It's right there on the screen, is you can go to download the information around the dates, the agenda, the topics we'll be discussing. Again, we are a First Nations-led organization that is about making better decisions. And in this case, about how you include Indigenous values in projects environmentally and economically to not only strengthen the Indigenous community, but to assist the aspirations and desires of that community for involvement in major projects. We are hoping to see you in Vancouver. Take a look at the agenda. Go to the resources tab on the main website of FNMPC.ca. Take a look at what we provide. We are happy to answer any questions that you have, and we look forward to seeing you in Vancouver in April. Mark, I'll see you. You'll be there as well?
I will be there. Look forward to it.
Thank you very much. So good day, everybody. See you in April.